嗨，大家好，我是戴淑轩，我来自英国，欢迎回到我的频道。有收到一些观众和学生问我，哪些报纸是比较适合学习英文的？这是一个非常好的问题，所以这次我制作这个影片来帮大家解答，希望你会喜欢。Alright, so I'm going to share with you some information about these newspapers so you can get an understanding of what kinds of people read these newspapers and whether they're suitable for your language learning. Having read at least a bit of each of these newspapers myself, I feel like I can share a little bit about what the language is like. Okay, so first and foremost is the BBC. Now this isn't technically a newspaper because they don't print the news, but you can obviously read it online. I'm sure all of you have read the BBC articles before. They're pretty great for language learning because they're really simple. They phrase the news and what's happened in such a clear, simple, easy to understand way, relatively speaking. So if you hear me say this and you think, I find the BBC really difficult, don't worry. It's also great for you to improve your language level, no matter where you are. So definitely focus on the BBC if you're not too sure where to start. Depending on the topic, some articles will be phrased in a more of a kind of complex way than others, and you can definitely pick up lots of new vocabulary from the BBC. But generally speaking, the structure of the sentences, for example, and the style is just a lot more accessible. And if we think about it, this news outlet is funded by annual television licensing fees. The general population, if they own a television, have to pay a little fee that goes towards supporting the BBC. So that means that the majority of the population will pay some sort of attention to the BBC usually, either watching it online or reading the news. That's the reason why this newspaper needs to be so accessible to the general population and why it's pretty good for you as an English learner. Now, as to whether the BBC is a reliable news source or not, historically speaking, the BBC has been considered to be relatively reliable. Recently, it feels like there's been more criticism of the BBC. In terms of political leanings, I found a YouGov survey that said that 34% of people, so most people, were not sure of the political leanings of the BBC at all, suggesting that they're pretty much neutral, I guess. 21% stated that the BBC is neutral, followed by 15% who thought that the BBC is more left-leaning, and 15% that felt like the BBC is slightly more right-leaning. In general, the BBC has been considered to be pretty neutral, slightly left-leaning. Now, what does that mean, left and right? If you want to learn more about the politics of the UK, then you can just head to my 全方位了解英国文化的课程. There's a topic called politics in there, and I share all about what that means. Alright, next I'm going to move into the newspapers that have the highest circulation, and these all happen to be tabloid newspapers. So the difference between tabloid and broadsheet is that originally, when these were only paper copies, the tabloid newspapers were kind of smaller, maybe this size, and broadsheet were the big ones that you can open like this. The association that people have with tabloid newspapers is that they're more gossipy, easy to read, and maybe less reliable, not such a great source of facts, whereas broadsheets are supposed to be more reliable, trustworthy, factual, and so on. First one of the most famous tabloids in the UK is called the Daily Mail. It was actually founded over 125 years ago in 1896, and you'll find in there all sorts of things, mostly about gossip, rumours, sports, viral news, and celebrity culture. So for that reason, you'll find that this newspaper uses fairly simple language in comparison to the broadsheet newspapers. You might struggle sometimes with some slang, some unusual turns of phrase, especially in the headlines. They'll use some puns usually, like jokey kind of headlines. And just so you know, the readership of the Daily Mail tends to be slightly older, and the newspaper is more right-leaning politically. They're also famous for being careless with the truth. The next tabloid is The Sun, also known for being careless with the truth. They are right-leaning and famous for being one of the most outrageous British newspapers, posting headlines that are completely inaccurate or a huge embellishment or exaggeration of the truth. They have also been known to expose scandals and gossip, such as more recently the Matt Hancock scandal. The Health Secretary had an affair. That was in The Sun. In terms of learning English, I'd say it's probably a pretty easy place to get started. If you want a bit of entertainment, a bit of light reading, some more simple phrasing and language, then definitely go for The Sun. Next is the Metro. The Metro is a free newspaper that you'll see on buses, trains, public transport, everywhere. It's the highest circulation free newspaper, which means that lots of people are reading it. They cover the news, sport, show business, celebrity gossip, and it was founded in 1999, so it's still a relatively old newspaper. Now, they are known to be a neutral newspaper, and they have never actually exposed their political leanings before. So if you happen to be on the bus, on the train, and you see this newspaper, definitely take it as a useful resource for you. The language is relatively simple, maybe a bit more difficult than The Sun and the Daily Mail, but easier than some of the other sources, which I'll get to in a second. Another free newspaper is the Evening Standard. It's distributed in London only, and it used to be called the London Evening Standard. It was founded almost 200 years ago in 1827, so that is an old newspaper. I find it to be slightly less gossipy than some of the other tabloids, quite a lot of tongue-in-cheek kind of humour, but it definitely would be suitable for language learners, and just so you know, it's slightly right-leaning politically. So all of these tabloids are essentially go for it. If you're learning English, it'll be quite interesting for you and hopefully relatively accessible language. The last tabloid that I'm going to mention is the Mirror. They are more left-leaning, which is more unusual for a tabloid, but their reputation in terms of upholding factual information and the truth is pretty low. The target audience for the Mirror is usually Labour supporters over the age of 35. But in terms of language learning and the English, I think that it's a safe bet. You can go for it. Just good to be aware of the background of what you're reading, because if you read the same source of news over and over and over, you're going to start to take on the beliefs of that newspaper, and that might not be what the general population actually thinks or feels. So definitely as a learner, try and keep things open, try different news sources if you can. Okay, let's move on to broadsheet or more kind of highbrow newspapers. I'll start with the left-leaning ones. One of the most highly regarded is The Guardian. It's quite well respected and has a relatively high level of quality journalism. That means that the articles are going to be written in more of a sophisticated and possibly flowery kind of way. Interesting uses of phrases, idioms, sentence structures. I mean, you might find one sentence is like a whole paragraph long, loads of vocab that you might never hear again, an old word that's been plucked out of the dictionary that's very rarely used, especially in speaking, but you'll see it in The Guardian. So that means that in terms of developing your English ability and making things more interesting for you and going to the next level, this is going to be great for you intermediate to advanced learners. But don't get too bogged down with looking up every word and trying to make sure that you've got all the vocab, because half of it, the new words, won't actually be that useful to you. So a lot of what we do in classes is I'll help you pick out the words that are relatively useful and are going to expand your knowledge of vocabulary, but aren't going to be totally useless that you'll never use again or never see again even. So the question is, why do the writers in that newspaper use such difficult and flowery language? It's to be more interesting. You know, as a native speaker, you'll think, oh wow, this is a cleverly crafted piece of writing. It's mind expanding. You know, we want to learn and to dive deeper into topics in more of a kind of intellectual way. So definitely have a stab at The Guardian if you really want to push your reading abilities to the next level. Another well-regarded newspaper is The Independent, and there's also the I newspaper now, which is a condensed version, and it's designed for people who don't have that much time. The Independent is a big, chunky newspaper, long articles, you know, lots of depth there, and many people might just not have that much time to warrant buying that big of a newspaper. So they've designed this smaller newspaper, which is totally accessible for language learners, I think. They're also a liberal newspaper, but slightly more centre-leaning, and the target audience is adults over the age of 35. It's considered quite a traditional, serious kind of newspaper, but definitely lots of interesting articles in there, and I also really recommend you to try this if you're intermediate to advanced level and you want to expand your reading ability. Now coming to the right-leaning newspapers, first of all we have The Times, which is very well respected. I find it to be a little drier than The Guardian in terms of reading, meaning that the sentences are more simple, almost more similar to the BBC sometimes. You know, just kind of factual, hard-hitting information, not going so much into depth. But obviously it depends on which article you're reading, what the topic is, who wrote it, and so on. Next, we have The Telegraph, which is another reputable right-leaning newspaper. Their readership is slightly older, with almost half of the readers being over the age of 45. The articles tend to be a bit shorter and structured a little bit more simply than the next newspaper that I'm going to tell you about, which is the Financial Times. So all of these newspapers are essentially recommended if you want to expand your reading ability, because they're reputable, supposedly good sources of information and news, and they're usually written quite well. So the Financial Times is possibly one of the most centre-leaning newspapers that I've mentioned so far. The articles tend to be much longer, more meaty, more difficult to understand, convoluted ways of phrasing things, difficult idioms and vocabulary. So you'll definitely find that one more challenging if you're a non-native speaker. It's a huge newspaper with 26 million readers, and they're mostly senior business decision makers, high net worth consumers, and influential policymakers. If you're hoping to move into these kind of fields, or you're really wanting to get to grips with how these kinds of people are thinking, what kind of information they're consuming, then definitely check this newspaper out. And last but not least, we've got The Economist. The Economist is more of a new newspaper. It's a bit more progressive and aimed at millennials, so usually younger people. 75% of their subscribers are male. It's more centre-leaning, and just to give you an idea, there's about 5 million readers, so much smaller than, let's say, the Financial Times. But I personally really enjoy The Economist. I find that the reporting style is very neutral, very factual. It does depend on the article, and you get different types of writers. Sometimes you'll get a piece that's really easy to understand, and other times the language is a bit more complex. But what's great is they have an app, and they also have the audio recordings of most of the articles, so you can sometimes read and listen at the same time, and that's great if you're learning English. Loads of really interesting articles in there, and they have more of a kind of global perspective, often talking about all kinds of stuff that's happening from around the world. I like listening to The Economist. It's called The Intelligence Podcast. They're nice and short, nice and kind of simple, but just help you understand what's going on in different places in the world and understand a bit of the background and the reasons why things are happening as well. Last but not least, I'm going to mention some newspapers that are specifically designed for beginners, so learners of English. If you're at a more beginner level, definitely check out E-News. They have the keywords for each article and also the audio files to help you. You can also try The Times in plain English, which is kind of like it sounds. It's the New York Times, but written in simple basic English. And then there's Words in the News, which is on BBC Learning English. They list important words and then show you news that's connected and using those words in context. It's a little bit more difficult, but if you're at intermediate or advanced level, then check out that as well. So best of luck on your reading journey, and let me know how you get on. 要找到自己能够读懂英文文章不容易，如果你想快速找到方法，那我每周提供的新闻内容可以帮助你快速提升阅读能力，并了解现代的英国文化。我的全方位了解英国文化课程，其中有一部分是我用中文解释，帮助你一句一句读懂英国新闻。赶快点击下方，一起了解更多吧。